So the reading is from 1 Kings 5, and the heading is Preparations for Building the Temple. When Hiram, king of Tyre, heard that Solomon had been anointed king to succeed his father David, he sent his envoys to Solomon, because he had always been on friendly terms with David. Solomon sent back this message to Hiram. You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, he could not build a temple for the name of the Lord his God, until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversary or disaster. I intend, therefore, to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord told my father David when he said, Your son, whom I will put on the throne in your place, will build a temple for my name. So give orders that cedars of Lebanon be cut down for me. My men will work with yours, and I will pay you for your men whatever wages you set. You know that we have no one so skilled in felling timber as the Sidonians. When Hiram heard Solomon's message, he was greatly pleased and said, Praise be to the Lord today, for he has given David a wise son to rule over this great nation. So Hiram sent word to Solomon, I have received the message you sent me, and will do all you want in providing the cedar and juniper logs. My men will haul them down from Lebanon to the Mediterranean Sea, and I will float them as rafts by sea to the place you specify. There I will separate them, and you can take them away, and you are to grant my wish by providing food for my royal household. In this way, Hiram kept Solomon supplied with all the cedar and juniper logs he wanted, and Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, in addition to 20,000 baths of pressed olive oil. Solomon continued to do this for Hiram year after year. The Lord gave Solomon wisdom just as he had promised him. There were peaceful relations between Hiram and Solomon. The two of them made a treaty. King Solomon conscripted laborers from all Israel, 30,000 men. He sent them off to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 a month, so that they spent 1 month in Lebanon and 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the forced labor. Solomon had 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills. Wow. As well as 33,000 foremen who supervised the project and directed the works. At the king's command, they removed from the quarry large blocks of high-grade stone to provide a foundation of dressed stone for the temple. The craftsmen of Solomon and Hiram and workers from Byblos cut and prepared the timber and stone for the building of the temple. And this is the word of the Lord.
Wow, now you might be thinking that's quite an interesting reading he's chosen this morning. Well, let's see where we land today. If I was to sum up in one word what I took away from my time at New Wine, other than wet, maybe, it wasn't that bad really. It was just like a Scottish summer. But if I was to sum up in one word, what it would be, the word is carriers. Carriers. And Ashley will put up my first slide for me today. On the very first morning at the Bible study, the guy got up to speak. And he spoke on this passage here, which I thought, I mean, I don't know about you, but when I read the Bible, there's some things I read in the Bible, I think, that's just not fair. There's some things I read in the Bible, I think, what? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't seem right. There's some things I read in the Bible, I think, God, what were you thinking? And this, which this guy spoke on the very first morning, is a story that I've grown up familiar with, which I've never thought was fair. I've never thought this was fair. What happens is the people of Israel, they're going to bring back the Ark of the Covenant, and they put it in a cart. And as the cart is coming through and they're bringing it back, the cart, it takes a bit of a topple, and Uzzah puts out his hand to stop the Ark of the Covenant falling on the ground, to steady it. And when he puts out his hand, God strikes him dead for touching the Ark of the Covenant. And to me, that just never seemed fair. God, it's one of these things I've read in the Bible and grew up with in the Bible, thinking, that's just not fair. I don't understand that. And the guy went on to unpick it. And he went on to say that the reason that we might think that was unfair is because that was never the way that God designed it to be moved. The Ark of the Covenant was always meant to be carried by Levites who had consecrated themselves. It was always meant to be carried that way. When you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. And the guy went on to speak, and I'm not going to preach his sermon because that would be cheating today, right? But he went on to speak about how do we use carts or are we carriers? And I've came away from that new wine week that I had there. And the word that's been ringing in my ears this week over and over and over and over and over again is the word carriers. Carriers. And I've been thinking this week, and I've been meditating, and I've been contemplating times in the Bible and places in the Bible where people were carriers. And when I typed into Google the word carriers into Bible Gateway, up came this passage that Rob read for us today about being carriers. And today, this morning, I think there's just 4 things I want to quickly say to you this morning that I believe God is challenging me on, which I hopefully will pass on the challenge to you on, about being carriers. And about how God is calling each and every one of us to be carriers. But what is it that He's calling us to carry? A few weeks ago, I spoke on I Am the Door. And I really believe that God really challenged me through that passage. And for those of you that were there or have watched it on YouTube, you see the picture of the shepherd who stays over the door. And Jesus says, I am the door, because He's the one who's... And there's a picture of a wall with one door, and there's no gate, there's no door, but the shepherd sleeps over the door because He is the door, because that's the way they built it out there. And I spoke about that, and I spoke about the passionate pursuit of the presence of Jesus. My desire and what I'm all about is about the passionate pursuit of the presence of Jesus. And I've contemplated that a lot recently, and I've contemplated that a lot on the carriers, because I think one of the things that God calls us to carry is to be carriers of God's presence. Carriers of God's presence. And I've been thinking this through. Am I really right in saying I'm about the passionate pursuit of the presence of Jesus? Because Jesus is everywhere. So how can I be about the passionate pursuit of the presence of somebody who's everywhere? How does that work? How can I be about the passionate pursuit of the presence of Jesus? And I've been thinking a lot about it recently. And I've been thinking about these 2 words, present and engaged. If I'm honest with you, there are times when I'm at home and my family are talking to me where I am present. This has been recorded. Right? Present, but not necessarily always engaged. There's times when I've been in conversation with people here, and I've been thinking, I need to get the school locked, or I need to get this out. And I'm aware of that. I'm very bad at that. That people can be talking to me, but I'm actually engaged in something else. It's a way that I'm kind of wired. Present and engaged. And while I think and believe that God is omnipresent and He is everywhere, I spoke recently about how the road to Emmaus and how God shows up where He's discussed. all of a sudden these two people are talking about about Jesus, and Jesus shows up, because Jesus shows up where he's discussed. There's something about the passionate pursuit of the presence of Jesus, where we are carriers of God's presence, and we seek the presence of Jesus, and we encounter the presence of Jesus, and in that, God engages with us in a whole new level, because our hearts want his presence. Carriers of God's presence. And as I was studying this for this week, for this message this morning, I came across this story, and I was reminded of this verse. In particular, this has really stood out to me in my Christian journey. And in Acts, it says this, right? Peter and John before the Sanhedrin, that's the title. But it says this: when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men. That gives me so much hope. They were unschooled, ordinary men. They were astonished, and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. I wonder, when we leave here today, will we be people who carry God's presence into our worlds? So much so that people will take note that we have been with Jesus. Will we be carriers of God's presence in our time of worship that we had? You're all present. But what about engaged? Will we encounter in our time of song worship, will we encounter the presence of Jesus so much so that people, when we walk out these doors today, will take note that we've been with Jesus and that we will be carriers of his presence? I believe that when we gather together on a Sunday, it's like there's a massive well here. And I want to ask you, how big's your bucket? When we come together, it's encouraging to hear Jane talk about the desires that we have, because I think this is like a well. And when we come, I don't know about you, but when I come together on a Sunday, when we gather together on a Sunday, I'm about the passionate pursuit of the presence of Jesus, and I want to take my bucket and I want to encounter God as much as I can, so that when I walk out these doors, I've got a big bucket load of God's presence, that I'll be a carrier of his presence wherever I go. Wherever I go. Another thing that I've been challenged on today, challenged on this week, is it will be carriers of God's burdens. Carriers of God's burdens. I was going to go with Nehemiah, but I'll give you a little bit of an insight into where we're going with Nehemiah. A few months ago, I led morning prayer, and you never know what you're going to... For anybody who doesn't know, morning prayer is an online gathering at 9 o'clock on the Warfield Church Facebook page. You never know, and I know that lots of people... It came out of COVID, when nobody was really working... Well, when people were out of familiar patterns, right? And so... yeah, that was a bad one. Anyway, right, so that came out of that, and it's still going on, and I know that a lot of people have returned to normal working patterns, but it still goes, and still people meet, and you never know what you're going to get. And I was given Nehemiah chapter 1, and God really broke my heart in preparation for that morning prayer, and I'm going to share with, over September and October, I'm going to do a 5-part series on Nehemiah chapter 1. Just breaking it down bit by bit. Nehemiah, just one chapter, 5 weeks. And breaking it all down. And I was going to go with Nehemiah, but I thought that would be kind of cheating. And so I've gone for something else. And I went for Rob's reading this morning, that we'll be carriers of God's burden. Can you imagine? And it was funny because Rob does no idea what I was going to talk on today, but he said, wow, that's a lot of people. Even in the middle of the reading, 70,000 carriers. And 80,000 stonecutters. I grew up in a town, I was thinking about it, I grew up in a town of 12,000 people. That's 70,000 carriers That's 6 times the population of Fraserburgh, where I grew up. 70,000 carriers and 80,000 stonecutters in the hills as Solomon looks to build God's temple. I want to ask us this morning, what's our part in building God's kingdom here in Warfield? What's the burden that God's laying in your heart? What's the burden that God, and the brokenness that God's opened your eyes to? What is the burden? You know, the famous story of this, I think it was St. Paul's Cathedral that was being built. And the architect at the time, he went round and he visited the building site, and he said to the guy who's on the cement mixer, "What are you doing?" He says, "Oh, I'm just mixing cement." He says to the builder, he says, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm just putting in stones." He said to the guy who was carrying the stones, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm building a cathedral." It all comes down to perspective. And I want to challenge our perspective today. Do you see yourself as just coming here to be encouraged, or to sit in a seat, or to go through the motions, or to do what you normally do on a Sunday? Or are you realizing that you are here to build God's kingdom? And it all comes through carrying a burden. What is God burdening you for? For Solomon, it was to build the temple. And so he appointed all these carriers. In order for us to build God's kingdom here in Warfield Church West, we need people who carry a burden for the lost. A burden for those who don't know Jesus. The next one's very similar. God's purposes, carriers of God's purposes. Why are you here? Why am I here? You know, God's created each and every one of us. He's given us giftings. He's given us talents. He's placed inside of us unique talents and giftings that together we can work together. I want to ask you, what's God's purpose for your life? Bracknell and Warfield will be transformed by people who know God's purpose for their life and who are carriers of God's purposes. And as I was thinking about this, I was reminded of the story of Esther. Mordecai, I went to Esther and said, "Esther, how can you live like this?" This is paraphrasing. "How can you live like this when we're all sort of suffering?" And she said, "Listen, if I go before the king and he doesn't reach out his scepter to me, I'm going to be cut off. I'm going to be killed." And Mordecai, he goes back to her and he says, "Listen, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows? But you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Can I boldly say today that you are here in this congregation? If you're a follower of Jesus, you are here for such a time as this. What is God's purpose for your life? As I say, Bracknell and Warfield will be changed by people who carry God's purposes. And lastly, I found this one fascinating when I came across this passage. It says, "We are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body." What have I taken away from my time at New Wine? It's all about being carriers of God's purpose, being carriers of God's burdens, being carriers of God's, let me find the first page, God's presence, being carriers of God's story. I want to ask us today, have you experienced God's story in your life? It's a story that goes something like this: that sin had entered the world and the relationship between God, the Father, and people had been cut off and destroyed because of disobedience and because of sin. But God had a plan, and his plan was that he was going to send his Son into the world. Because what God did in the time being, what God did was he said, listen, in order for you to deal with the sin problem in your lives that all you people have, you're going to have to offer these sacrifices. And when you offer these sacrifices, that's going to make you clean until you mess up again. But you're going to then offer another sacrifice. And if you do this sort of sin, you'll do that sort of sacrifice. You do that sort of sin, you can do that sort of sacrifice. So God created the sacrifice system in order to deal with this problem called sin. But ultimately, God had a plan, and that plan was Jesus. That plan is Jesus. And Jesus came into this world, God's only Son. The Bible says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. And so God the Father gave Jesus. And what Jesus did is Jesus became the sacrifice. Once and for all, the Bible says, he became the sacrifice for sin. And he paid the price for man and woman's disobedience. He paid the price. And what he did is he became the bridge so that people and God the Father, the relationship can be restored. And so that we would have access to the Father. And that's what we access when we gather together. And the passionate pursuit of the presence of Jesus is all made possible because of Jesus and because of what he's done. So Jesus became the ultimate sacrifice. He became the bridge in order that the relationship could be restored. And that's the story that we believe. That's why we sing, if you've been forgiven, and if you bear his name. Because what happens is we come to a place where we say, God, I realize that that's a story that's true. I realize that you came and you sent your son Jesus in order that I could be free. And I realize that. And what happens is we have an encounter with God and the relationship is restored. And all of a sudden, not only do we get forgiven, but we get adopted into God's family. How incredible is that? And that's why we sing. If we have a revelation of what he's done for us. And that's God's story. And that's why we sung this morning, this is my story. Because the incredible thing is that God's story can become your story. This amazing story. You know something? The challenge for each and every one of us is that when we walk out these doors today, that we would be carriers of God's story and that we would tell people about the love of the Father who sent Jesus. That we would be carriers of God's story into our workplaces, carriers of God's stories into our families, carriers of God's story wherever we find ourselves this week. And this month, this year, that we would be carriers. And so I want to end with one challenge. And it's a very simple challenge today. When you sit there today and you evaluate your life, for those of you that love Jesus, you evaluate your faith and your walk with God today. What are we carrying today? Are we carrying God's presence? Are we carrying God's burdens? Are we carrying God's purposes? Are we carrying God's story? Or are we carrying burdens that he never intended for us to carry? We've allowed things into our lives that have multiplied and grown, and all of a sudden we look like the picture of the guy on the right. I just sense in my spirit right now that it's not always as black and white as this. I hadn't planned to say this. It's not always this black and white. Some of you are in the left-hand side carrying the presence and fully engaged today, but tomorrow you'll pick up another rucksack. And you'll lay all the other stuff down on the left. The presence of God, the desire for the presence. So you get in your car and you come here next week. And there's a challenge for each and every one of us today to continually desire the presence of Jesus. To continually desire, and that may be a word for you today. But without saying any more, can I just invite us to close our eyes, stand, and to close our eyes, and just to take a moment to consider, what are we carrying today? My takeaway from New Wine, carriers, what am I carrying?